Seren had rehearsed exactly one sentence for this moment. "There has been a mistake, Your Majesty." Simple, clear, dignified. What actually came out of her mouth was, "I am not who you think I am, and I am so sorry about the letters." The Great Hall did not gasp. It did something worse. It went silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that presses down on your shoulders and makes your knees want to buckle. 40 nobles, 12 advisors, 6 guards, and a boy carrying a tray of wine goblets all turned to stare at the woman standing at the foot of the king's dais in a borrowed dress with ink still faintly staining her fingertips. King Soren Kaleheart sat on his throne like he had been carved from the same dark stone that built it. His jaw was set. His gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like a sentence being read very, very carefully. In his left hand, he held her letter. In his right, his own. The original, the one that was never meant for her. "You are not Lady Vela Ashbourne," he said. It was not a question. "No, Your Majesty," Seren managed. Her voice came out approximately 1 octave higher than usual. "I am a bookbinder. From Mirandale." Another silence, heavier than the last. "A bookbinder," he repeated, and she watched his thumb move across the edge of her letter, pressing into the paper like he could feel the words through his skin. She should explain. She should tell him how the courier had ridden into Mirandale 3 weeks ago with a sealed letter bearing the royal crest, addressed to the Lady of Ashbourne House, Mirren Road. How there was no Ashbourne House on Mirren Road. How there was only the bookbindery where Seren had lived since she was old enough to hold a needle and thread, and the courier had knocked on her door because it was the only door on Mirren Road with a woman behind it. She should tell him how she had opened the letter because it had been delivered to her, and how the words inside had stolen her breath. She had not known they were royal. The seal meant nothing to a girl who had never seen one before. She had read them because they were the loneliest words she had ever encountered. A man writing to a stranger about the weight of something he could not name, about nights that stretched too long and rooms that felt too large. She had done something reckless. She had written back. Not as Lady Vela Ashbourne, not as anyone, just as herself, a bookbinder with ink under her nails and too many opinions about the way loneliness works. He had written again. She had written again. 3 letters each, spanning 3 weeks, each one longer and more honest than the last. His words grew rawer, hers grew braver. She told him about the way autumn smelled in Mirandale, about the satisfaction of a perfectly bound spine, about the hollow feeling of being surrounded by thousands of stories and never being the subject of any of them. He told her things she suspected he had never told anyone. And then the summons arrived. Not a letter this time, but an official decree with the king's seal and the words, "Lady Vela Ashbourne is commanded to present herself at court." Seren had stared at it, and the floor had dropped out from under her world. She was not Vela Ashbourne. She had never been Vela Ashbourne, and the man she had been writing to was the Alpha King. She had considered running. She had considered burning the letters and pretending the last 3 weeks had not happened. But the summons was a royal command, and ignoring a royal command was treason, and Seren was not built for treason. She was built for binding books and making terrible decisions, apparently. So she had come. She had presented herself to the steward, who had looked at her borrowed dress and calloused fingers and asked if she was lost. She had been ushered into the great hall, introduced as Lady Vela Ashbourne, and had lasted exactly 40 seconds before the real Lady Vela Ashbourne's portrait on the far wall caught her eye. Golden-haired, blue-eyed, and breathtaking. Seren had dark hair, dark eyes, and a callus on her right middle finger from years of stitching leather. She could have kept pretending. But the king was looking at her, and his letters were in her memory, every word, and she could not lie to a man who had told her he was tired of people lying to him. So she had opened her mouth and ruined everything. Now King Soren stared at her across the silence of the great hall, and she watched him unfold her letter, the 3rd one, the long one, the one where she had told him that the bravest thing a powerful man could do was admit he was afraid. "You read my letters," he said. His voice was low, controlled, but something beneath it cracked like ice under pressure. "Yes, Your Majesty. All of them. Yes." "And you wrote back?" His gaze dropped to her letter in his hand. "You wrote back with honesty I did not ask for, about things I told no one, to a man you believed was a stranger." Seren's throat constricted. "I thought you were lonely," she whispered. "I thought someone should answer." The king's expression did not change, but his hand closed around her letter and something behind his eyes shifted in a way she could not read. "Take her to the east wing," he said to the guard nearest the dais. "She does not leave the palace grounds." Seren's stomach plummeted. "Your Majesty, please, I did not mean any harm." But he had already turned away, and the guard's hand was on her arm, firm and unyielding, and the great hall was watching her be escorted out like a criminal. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was the king pressing her letter flat against his knee, his thumb tracing the edge of the page the way someone touches something they are afraid to lose. The room they put her in was nicer than any room she had ever slept in, which made it worse. A bed with actual pillows, a window overlooking the eastern gardens, a fireplace someone had bothered to light. It felt less like a prison and more like a holding pen for someone the palace had not yet decided what to do with. Seren sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. Ink stains on the left, a needle scar across the right thumb. Hands that belonged to a bookbinder from a village no one had heard of. Not to a woman who had just stood before the Alpha King and admitted she had read his private correspondence and responded to it like a fool. She had not slept. She had barely breathed. Every footstep in the corridor outside her door sent her heart lurching into her throat, expecting guards, expecting chains, expecting a sentence she had earned through sheer audacity. What she did not expect was a knock, followed by a tall, broad-shouldered man with steady brown eyes and the calm demeanor of someone who had spent his entire life managing crises he did not create. "Miss Seren," he said. "My name is Thane. I serve as the king's beta." "Am I being arrested?" Seren blurted. Thane blinked at her. "No." "Executed?" Also no. "Banished? Publicly humiliated? Thrown into a ditch?" The faintest crease appeared at the corner of his mouth. "The king does not throw people into ditches, Miss Seren. He has people for that." Seren could not tell if that was a joke. She decided not to ask. "You are being summoned," Thane said. "The king wishes to speak with you privately." The walk through the palace corridors felt like walking to the edge of a cliff. Thane walked beside her in silence, and Seren tried to read something in his expression. She failed. The man had a face like a closed book. "Is he angry?" she asked. "The king's emotions are not mine to describe," Thane said carefully. "That means yes." Thane did not confirm or deny. They stopped before a heavy wooden door carved with the Kaleheart crest, a wolf mid-stride beneath a crescent moon. Thane knocked twice and opened it without waiting for an answer. The king's study was smaller than she had expected. Dark wood, heavy curtains, a desk buried under papers and journals. Candles burned on every surface, too many of them, like someone was afraid of the dark. And behind the desk, the king stood with his back to the door, staring out the window at the gray morning sky. He did not turn around when they entered. "Leave us," he said to Thane. The door clicked shut. Seren was alone with the king. The silence stretched. He still had not turned. "You wrote that loneliness is not the absence of people," he said finally. His voice was quieter here, stripped of the authority it carried in the great hall. "You wrote that it is the presence of people who do not see you." Seren's breath caught. He was quoting her letter, word for word. "Yes," she said. He turned then, and the morning light fell across his face, and Seren saw what she had not seen in the great hall. the shadows carved beneath his eyes, the slight hollowness at his temples, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of something clenched too long. "I have a question," he said, his gaze locking onto hers with that same unsettling intensity. "And I need you to answer honestly." "I have been nothing but honest with you, Your Majesty," Seren said, and immediately regretted the edge in her voice. His expression shifted. Not anger, something closer to surprise. "Yes," he said quietly. "I suppose you have." He moved to his desk and picked up one of the many journals stacked there, flipped it open, and frowned at the page. His finger traced a line of writing, then stopped. He closed the journal slowly. "The trade agreement with Heroin Province," he said. "Do you happen to know what day that was signed?" Seren stared at him. "Why would I know that?" "You would not." He set the journal down. "I would. I signed it. 3 days ago, apparently." He tapped the journal. "I had to read that this morning to remember it." The words settled over her like cold water. "I do not understand," Seren said carefully. Thane appeared in the doorway as though summoned by instinct. The king looked at his beta, and something passed between them, silent and heavy. "Tell her," Soren said. Thane stepped inside and closed the door. "The king has a condition," he said, his voice measured. "His memories are failing. Not from age, not from injury. They simply vanish. Each morning, pieces of the previous days are gone. Names, faces, conversations, decisions. They dissolve like ink in water." Seren felt the floor tilt beneath her. "How long?" she whispered. 14 months, Thane replied. 14 months. 14 months of losing himself, one fragment at a time. Seren looked at the journals stacked across the desk, the shelves behind him lined with dozens more, and understood. He was writing everything down because his own mind could not be trusted to hold it. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Thane and the king exchanged another look. Then Soren reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with cord. "Her letters. All 3 of them. I remember these," he said. "Every word. Every sentence. Every detail you shared about Autumn and Mirandale and the smell of binding glue and the way you described the feeling of being invisible." He set the letters on the desk between them. "I forget the names of my own advisors. I forget treaties I negotiated. Yesterday, I forgot that my mother preferred lilacs." His voice did not waver, but something beneath it splintered. "But I remember your letters like I read them this morning." The quiet that followed pressed against her eardrums like a held breath. "Stay," Thane said. "We need to understand why this is happening." Seren looked at the king, at the journals, at the letters, at the man who was losing himself and somehow holding on to her words like they were the last solid ground in a world that was dissolving beneath his feet. She did not have a choice. She knew that. But she also knew she would have stayed even if she did. The arrangement was simple. Seren was to remain in the palace as the king's personal scribe. She would attend his meetings, sit at the edge of his study while he worked, and read to him when documents required review. The official explanation given to the court was that she possessed a rare skill in archival transcription. The unofficial truth was that the king's beta wanted her within arm's reach of the king at all times to see if her presence continued to slow whatever was eating his memory alive. No one used the word curse. Not yet. But Seren thought it every time she watched Soren pause mid-sentence, his eyes going distant, his hand hovering over a page while he searched for a word that had been there a moment ago and was now simply gone. The first 3 days were brutal. He barely acknowledged her. She sat in a chair against the wall of his study and transcribed documents while he worked in silence. He never looked at her directly. He spoke to her only when necessary, his tone clipped and formal, as though she were a piece of furniture he had been forced to accommodate. She understood. She was a stranger who had stumbled into his most closely guarded secret. A nobody from a village no one could find on a map, sitting in his private study, watching him forget. On the fourth morning, it happened. 3 advisors had gathered in the study to discuss a border dispute with the Valthan territories. Seren sat in her usual chair, quill in hand, recording the conversation. The lead advisor, a sharp-jawed man named Counselor Orin, was explaining troop movements along the northern pass. The king listened, nodded, asked a precise question about supply routes, and then stopped. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Seren watched his eyes go blank for a fraction of a second, like a candle flickering in a draft. He had lost it. The thread of the conversation, the name of the pass, maybe both. Counselor Orin waited. The other advisors shifted uncomfortably. Without thinking, Seren leaned forward slightly and murmured, "Grey Hollow Pass, Your Majesty. 14 supply wagons diverted last week due to flooding on the eastern route." The words were barely audible, pitched only for him. Soren's gaze cut to her, sharp and startled, and for a moment their eyes locked. Then he turned back to Orin and continued the discussion as though nothing had happened. His voice was steady, his questions precise, his authority absolute. No one else noticed. But Seren's hands were shaking. After the advisors left, the king sat motionless behind his desk for a long time. Seren did not move either. She barely breathed. "Grey Hollow Pass," he said finally, not looking at her. "You remembered that." "I wrote it down yesterday when you approved the supply diversion," Seren said quietly. "I approved a supply diversion," he repeated, and the flatness in his voice made her chest ache because she could hear it. The gap where the memory should have been, the hollow space where knowledge had lived and been stolen. She wanted to say something comforting, something wise. What came out was, "You also approved a new stable roof and complained about the cost of nails for 11 minutes. I have detailed notes on the nail situation if you need them." Soren looked at her. For one terrible second she thought she had overstepped entirely. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, not quite, but something adjacent to one, something that lived in the same territory. 11 minutes, he said. "I timed it," Seren confirmed. He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, and something in the room shifted, subtle and unnamed. After that, a pattern formed. Seren stopped being a scribe who happened to be in the room and became something else, a bridge between the king and the parts of himself that kept disappearing. She anticipated his gaps, supplied missing names before the silence could stretch, guided him back with murmured phrases no one else could hear, and handed him her notes without being asked. They did not discuss it. He did not thank her. But on the 6th day, she arrived at the study to find a new quill on her desk. Not the standard issue quill the palace supplied to scribes, a proper one, goose feather, perfectly trimmed, the kind that cost more than she earned in a month back in Mirandale. "Thank you for the quill," she said that evening as she organized her transcription pages. The king did not look up from his journal. "What quill?" Seren bit back a smile and said nothing. The next morning, a pot of ink appeared beside the quill. The morning after that, a leather folio embossed with a small crescent moon. She stopped mentioning them. He stopped pretending he had not placed them there. On the 9th day, Seren arrived early and found the king already at his desk, his journal open in front of him, his pen unmoving. He was staring at a page near the front. The ink was older there, faded slightly, written in a hand that was shakier than his current one. He did not hear her enter. She saw the words on the page before she could look away. Mother's voice. I am forgetting the sound. Lower than most, she hummed when she was thinking. What was the melody? Seren's throat closed. She backed toward the door, but her heel caught the edge of the rug, and the soft scrape made him look up. He closed the journal immediately, his face shuddering like a door slamming shut. "You are early," he said, his voice perfectly controlled. "I am sorry, Your Majesty." There is nothing to apologize for. But his hand stayed pressed flat against the journal's cover, guarding it like a wound. That night, alone in her room, Seren pulled out the letters she had brought from Mirandale. She read them again by candlelight, and this time the loneliness in them hit differently, because now she knew what was behind it. He was not just isolated. He was disappearing. Every raw, honest word he had written to her was a man trying to pour himself onto paper before there was nothing left to pour. She pressed the letters to her chest and blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. The next morning, she found a single entry in his journal that he had left open on the desk, turned to a page near the back. She was not sure if he had left it deliberately or simply forgotten to close it. The entry read, "The bookbinder remembered the melody. I did not ask her to hum it. She simply did, while sorting her pages, as though it were nothing. I have not heard that melody in 4 months. She cannot know what she has given back to me. She cannot know that I am afraid of what happens when she leaves." Seren sat down slowly, her hands trembling, and stared at the words until they blurred. 2 weeks passed, and Seren discovered that proximity to the Alpha King was an education in contradictions. He was terrifying and meticulous, brutal in counsel and gentle with the stable hounds that followed him across the courtyard. He could silence a room with a look, and then lose the name of the man he had just silenced. He wrote with the discipline of a scholar and forgot what he had written by morning, and he was paying attention to her in ways she was only beginning to notice. It started small. A book appeared on her desk, a collection of folklore from the eastern provinces, with a slip of paper marking a story about a girl who bound the wind into a leather spine. She had mentioned that story once, in passing, during a conversation he should not have remembered. Then the fire in her quarters started being lit before she returned each evening. She had not mentioned being cold. She had simply rubbed her hands together once in his study. A reflex, nothing more. But the fires appeared anyway, and they were always perfectly stoked, and she stopped pretending she did not know who had ordered them. One evening, as the palace settled into the heavy quiet of late autumn, Seren sat in her usual chair and read aloud from a territorial survey while the king worked. It was dry material, boundary disputes and acreage tallies, the kind of prose that could put a wolf to sleep. She added commentary without meaning to. This section claims Lord Harwell's eastern pasture extends to the river, which is fascinating because Lord Harwell's own correspondence from last spring puts the boundary at the old mill, which is a full quarter-mile shorter. Someone is lying, and my money is on the man with the larger sheep herd. She glanced up. The king had stopped writing. He was looking at her with an expression she could not decode, focused and intent, like she was a passage in a language he was still learning to read. "What?" Seren asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You do that," he said. "Do what?" "Make things interesting." He paused as though the admission had cost him something. "Reports, documents, territorial surveys, they are necessary, but insufferable. You make them something I want to listen to." Seren felt heat crawl up her neck. "It is just reading, Your Majesty." "No," he said, quieter now. "It is not." They held each other's gaze for a moment too long. Seren looked away first, her heart hammering, and pretended to find her place in the survey. Later that night, she told him a story. Not from a book, from memory. A tale Odessa used to tell her as a child about a lighthouse keeper who fell in love with a storm and spent her whole life learning how to stand in the wind without being knocked down. She told it because the study was quiet and the fire was low, and he had that look again. The one he wore when the forgetting pressed too close, and the journals were not enough. She did not notice when he set down his pen. She did not notice when he leaned back in his chair, his shoulders loosening for the first time all day. She only noticed when she finished the story, and the silence that followed was not heavy, but warm. "The lighthouse keeper," Soren said the next morning when she arrived. "Did she ever learn?" Seren froze in the doorway. "Learn what?" "To stand in the wind." He remembered. Not just the story, but the question at its heart, the detail she had left unresolved on purpose. She stared at him, and something enormous and terrifying shifted in her chest. I do not know, she said honestly. Odessa never finished the story. She said some stories do not end. They just keep happening. I like that, he said, and the softness in his voice almost undid her. She went to Thane that afternoon. The king remembered my story, Seren said without preamble. Word for word, from last night. But he forgot Counselor Oren's name again this morning. Oren has served him for 6 years. How is that possible? Thane studied her for a long moment. We do not know, but it is getting worse. He is losing more each week. Faces now. Voices. Yesterday, he could not remember which door led to his mother's old chambers. Seren's stomach dropped. If it follows its current course, Thane continued, the king will lose the ability to recognize his own counsel within 3 months. Within 6 months, he may not remember his own name. The room tilted. Seren gripped the edge of the desk. But you, Thane said, his gaze sharpening. Everything connected to you, he holds. Your letters, your stories, your words, your face. We have tested it carefully. You are the only exception. Seren shook her head. That does not make sense. No, Thane agreed. It does not. Which is why you are going to stay close to him, closer than before. Not just in his study. I want you present at his evening briefings, at his meals. Whatever you are doing to anchor his memory, we need more of it. I am not doing anything, Seren protested. I am just there. Thane gave her a long, measured look. Then just be there more. That night, Seren could not sleep. She lay in her borrowed bed and thought about a man who could command armies and silence a hall full of nobles with a single word, but who could not hold on to the sound of his own mother's voice. And she thought about the impossible fact that he could hold on to hers. She was not special. She was a bookbinder from a village that did not appear on most maps. She had no magic, no bloodline, no gift. She had only ever had words, other people's words, copied and bound and preserved for someone else to read. But his words had changed something in her, and her words had changed something in him. At some point, sleep found her, and then the dream found her. She was standing in a vast gray space that stretched in every direction without walls or horizon. The air was cold and still and tasted like dust. Around her, rising from the ground like silent monuments, stood thousands of library shelves, stretching higher than she could see, packed with books and scrolls. But they were dissolving. As she watched, a book on the nearest shelf trembled, then its spine cracked, and its pages curled inward and turned to fine gray ash that drifted upward and disappeared. Another followed, then another. A slow, relentless cascade of disintegration, an entire library unmade 1 volume at a time. Seren walked forward, her bare feet making no sound. The silence pressed against her like a living thing. She found him at the center. Soren stood with his back to her, motionless, watching a shelf directly in front of him. The books on it were older than the others, their spines cracked and faded. As she watched, one of them began to tremble. He reached for it, and his hand passed through it like smoke. You should not be here, he said without turning around. His voice was flat, exhausted, like a man who had watched this happen every night for 14 months and had stopped believing it could be stopped. Serene opened her mouth to answer, but the gray space lurched, the shelves groaned, and a sound like tearing paper ripped through the silence. She woke gasping, her sheets twisted around her legs, her heart slamming against her ribs. Morning light crept pale and thin through the curtains. She could still taste the dust on her tongue. She could still feel the cold. And she could still see him standing in that terrible, endless library, watching himself disappear one memory at a time, completely and utterly alone. 3 weeks in, and Seren had become fluent in the language of a man who was losing himself. She knew the signs now. The slight pause before he spoke, the way his hand would drift to his journal before answering a question, the barely perceptible tightening around his eyes when a name dissolved mid-thought. She knew the difference between a natural pause and a desperate search through empty shelves. She also knew things about him that had nothing to do with his condition. She knew he drank his tea without honey, even though he clearly preferred it sweet. She knew his handwriting changed when he was tired, the letters growing wider and looser. She knew the sound of his breathing when he was concentrating, slow and measured, and the sound of it when the forgetting crept close, shallow, and held in the chest like a man bracing for a blow. She was learning him the way she had once learned books, by the texture and the grain and the places where the binding showed strain. And he was learning her. You chew the end of your quill when you disagree with something but have decided not to say it, he observed one afternoon, without looking up from his correspondence. Seren pulled the quill from her mouth. I do not. You are doing it now. I was thinking. You were disagreeing. He glanced up, and the faintest trace of warmth flickered across his expression. With what? Seren hesitated. Councillor Oren's proposal to tax the river merchants. It will collapse the grain trade within 2 seasons. But it is not my place to say so. And yet, you just said so. You asked. I did. He held her gaze, and something in the silence between them felt different from the silences that had come before. Charged. Intentional. Like he was choosing to look at her, rather than simply forgetting to look away. Serene's wolf stirred. It was faint, barely a flutter beneath her ribs, but it startled her so badly she knocked her inkwell sideways. Black ink bled across the desk like a wound. She scrambled to contain it, muttering apologies, pressing a cloth against the spreading stain. The king said nothing, but when their hands brushed as he passed her a dry cloth, the flutter became a pull, sharp and low in her chest, and Seren yanked her hand back like she had been burned. Her wolf had been quiet her entire life, dormant. Odessa had told her some wolves simply slept longer than others. Seren had accepted this the way she accepted most things about herself, as evidence that she was less than what she was supposed to be, but now something was waking up. And it was pulling toward him. She went to Thane that evening. I need the truth, she said, standing in the doorway of his office. All of it. What is happening to the king is not a disease, is it? Thane set down his pen and studied her with those steady, unreadable eyes. No, he said. It is not. The story came out in pieces, measured and deliberate, as though Thane had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. 2 years ago, the king had led a campaign against a rogue alpha named Erevan, who had been raiding the border settlements, burning villages, and terrorizing families who refused to submit to his authority. Soren had pursued every diplomatic option. Erevan had rejected all of them. When a delegation of 3 unarmed envoys never returned from Erevan's camp, Soren had marched. The war was brief and devastating. Erevan fell in the final battle, but his bonded mate, a woman named Lysara who carried the old gift of memory craft, had knelt beside Erevan's body and spoken the curse through her grief. You have taken everything I will ever remember, Lysara had said. Now everything you remember will be taken from you, not all at once, slowly, until there is nothing left but the forgetting. Memory craft, Seren repeated, her voice hollow. An old magic, Thane confirmed. Rare, nearly extinct. It binds directly to the mind. Our healers have tried everything. Herbalists, seers, even a witch from the northern marshes who owed the crown a debt. Nothing has slowed it. Nothing except me, Seren whispered. Thane's silence was confirmation enough. How long does he have? She asked. At the current rate of deterioration, 3 months, perhaps 4. After that, he will not remember who he is, where he is, or why any of it matters. Thane paused. He will still be alive. His body will function. But the man inside will be gone. Seren gripped the doorframe. That night she sat beside him in the study as usual. He was writing in his journal, his pen moving in quick, precise strokes. The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the windows. Everything felt unbearably normal. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. He looked up. "Tell me something you are afraid of forgetting." The pen stopped. He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched the walls behind his eyes shift, not falling, but thinning, becoming translucent. "My father's hands," he said. "He had a scar across his left palm from a hunting accident. He used to press that hand against my head when I was small. I can still feel the ridge of it." He paused. "Some mornings I cannot remember which hand it was." Seren's eyes burned. She reached out and took his hand before she could stop herself. His fingers closed around hers immediately, tight, instinctive, and the pull in her chest flared so sharply it stole her breath. His pupils dilated. His breathing changed. "Seren," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a word he had been practicing in the dark. She should have let go. She held on. The room blurred. The fire dimmed. The walls dissolved. She was in the gray space again. The library. But this time it was louder, the sound of disintegration echoing from every direction, a constant rustling whisper of pages turning to ash. Shelves groaned, volumes crumbled. The dust was thicker now, coating her tongue, her lungs. She saw him across the ruins, standing before a shelf that was half empty. His hand hovered over a book, whose spine was cracking before his eyes. "This place will take you too," he said again. But this time, his voice cracked on the last word. The library shuddered. Seren was ripped backward through the gray, and she gasped awake in the study, her hand still locked in his. Soren was staring at her, his face white. "You were there," he said. It was not a question. "You saw it." Seren's heart hammered. "How long has it been like that?" He pulled his hand free slowly, and the loss of contact left a cold hollow in her chest that made her gasp. "Every night," he said. "Every single night for 14 months. By morning, everything had changed. Seren woke to pounding on her door. Thane stood in the corridor, his face drawn tighter than she had ever seen it. "The king knows you entered the Fade," he said. "He is requesting your presence. Immediately." Requesting, Seren noticed, not summoning. The distinction should have been comforting. It was not. She found Soren standing by the window of his study, his back to the door, his shoulders rigid beneath his shirt. He did not turn when she entered. The journals on his desk were closed. The quill she had come to think of as hers had been removed. "How many times?" he asked, his voice stripped of everything except control. "Twice," Seren said. "Last night and once before, 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks! He turned, and the expression on his face was worse than anger. It was fear. Raw and undisguised, the kind of fear that only surfaces when something precious is threatened. "You have been entering that place for 3 weeks, and you said nothing." "I did not understand what it was." "It does not matter what it is." His voice rose, then caught, and he pressed his hand against his mouth like he was physically holding the words back. When he spoke again, it was quieter, but no less devastating. "What matters is that it is mine, my curse, my prison. And you walked into it like it was a room with an open door." "I did not choose to go there," Seren said, her voice shaking. "I touched your hand, and it pulled me in." Something fractured behind his eyes. "Then we stopped touching." The words landed like a physical blow. Seren felt them in her sternum, a sharp crack that radiated outward. "Your Majesty, we stop all of it." He moved behind his desk, putting furniture between them, putting distance where there had been warmth. "The proximity, the evenings, the stories. You will be reassigned to the palace archives. Thane will arrange new quarters on the opposite side of the grounds." "You cannot be serious." "I am entirely serious." His jaw was set like iron, but his hands were trembling. She could see them, pressed flat against the desk, shaking. "If the Fade takes hold of you, there is no coming back," he said. "I have watched it consume my memories for over a year. I will not watch it consume yours. That is not your decision to make. I am the king," he said, and the authority in his voice should have been absolute, but it was undermined by the way his breath hitched on the last word. "Everything in this palace is my decision. My mind is not your palace." Seren shot back, and she saw the words hit him, saw him flinch like she had struck him across the jaw. The quiet between them was unbearable. "Please," he said, and the word sounded foreign in his mouth, like something he had not used in years. "Please go, before I cannot let you." Seren stared at him, at the trembling hands and the rigid shoulders and the fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with losing his own mind and everything to do with losing hers. She left. She walked back to her quarters on legs that felt borrowed, packed the few belongings she had accumulated, and let a guard escort her to a small room in the western wing that smelled like dust and disuse. The bed was narrow. The window faced a stone wall. There was no fireplace. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together in her lap and did not cry. She refused. She would not give this moment tears. 3 days passed, then 4, then 5. The absence hit like a slow poison. It started in her chest, a persistent ache that spread outward into her limbs, her throat, her head. Migraines arrived on the second day, brutal and blinding. Her appetite vanished. Her wolf, so recently awakened, paced and whined beneath her skin like an animal in a cage too small for its body. She heard things, fragments, his voice reading from a report, the scratch of his pen, the way he breathed when he was concentrating. Phantom echoes of a man she was being kept from. On the 4th day, she forgot the name of the ink supplier in Mirandale. A man she had ordered from every month for 6 years. She stood at the wash basin, her hands dripping, and felt the name dissolve like sugar in water, there one moment and simply absent the next. Terror seized her by the throat. On the 6th day, Thane found her in the archives where she had been reassigned. She was sitting at a desk surrounded by catalogs she could not focus on, her hands trembling, her skin pale. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you." "He looks worse." Thane pulled a chair beside her and sat. "He has lost 9 days of memory since you were removed from his presence. 9 days in less than a week. Before, with you near him, the loss had slowed to fragments. Now entire blocks are disappearing overnight." Seren closed her eyes. "Is he sleeping?" "He is not. The Fade takes him the moment he closes his eyes, and without you there, nothing pulls him out. He woke this morning and did not recognize Counselor Hale. He has known Hale for 12 years. And he still will not let me come back? He would sooner lose himself entirely than risk harming you," Thane said quietly. "That should tell you everything you need to know about how he feels." It did. And it made the ache in her chest infinitely worse. On the 7th morning, Seren woke and could not remember Odessa's face. The shape of it was there, the sense of warmth and ink-stained fingers, but the specifics had blurred like a painting left in the rain. She sat upright in bed, her heart slamming, her hands shaking, and understood with perfect, horrifying clarity what was happening. The curse was spreading. Through whatever connection bound her to Soren, the Fade was reaching for her too. She was starting to forget. An hour later, a messenger arrived at her door. "Miss Seren," the boy said, out of breath and wide-eyed. "The Beta sent me. The king collapsed during the morning council. He did not recognize where he was." The boy swallowed. He did not recognize himself. Seren ran. She did not wait for permission. She ran through corridors and past startled servants, her breath tearing in and out of her lungs until she reached the council chamber. The doors were open. Inside, the chamber was nearly empty. Overturned chairs. A water pitcher shattered on the floor. and at the far end of the long table, Soren sat with his head in his hands while Thane knelt beside him. He looked up when she entered. For one terrible, endless second, his eyes were blank, empty. The gray of them flat and unfocused, like windows in an abandoned house. Then recognition flickered. Faint at first, then brighter, spreading across his face like dawn. Seren, he said. Her name. He remembered her name. She crossed the room and dropped to her knees in front of him, taking his face in her hands. His skin was cold. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he had not slept in a week, which, she realized, he probably had not. How bad? She asked Thane without taking her eyes off Soren. He lost consciousness for nearly a minute, Thane said. When he came to, he did not know the year, did not know the room. It took almost 10 minutes to orient him. Serene's thumbs moved across Soren's cheekbones, steadying him. His eyes tracked her face with desperate focus, like she was the only fixed point in a world that had gone liquid. You are not supposed to be here, he murmured. And you are not supposed to be dying, Seren replied. His jaw tightened. I gave you an order. You gave me a terrible order, and I am ignoring it. A crack appeared in his composure. Not amusement. Something rawer, something closer to relief. I am forgetting too, Seren said. The words fell out of her before she could soften them. Since you sent me away. I forgot my ink supplier's name. I forgot Odessa's face. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to know it is happening. The color drained from his face. No, he breathed. Yes. Seren held his gaze. Your curse. It is spreading through whatever connects us. And sending me away made it worse for both of us. Not better. Soren shook his head. That is not possible. The curse was spoken for me. It should not be able to reach you. And you should not be able to remember my letters when you cannot remember your own advisors, Seren countered. Nothing about this follows the rules you think it does. Thane rose slowly. I will clear the corridor, he said, and something in his voice suggested he understood more than he was saying. He left without another word, pulling the chamber doors shut behind him. Neither of them spoke. The chamber felt vast and still. Soren stared at her, and she watched the war behind his eyes, the desperate pull between protecting her and needing her, between duty and the thing neither of them had named. I dream about the letters, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. They are the last thing the Fade takes each night and the first thing that comes back each morning. I hold on to them like a rope in the dark. He paused, his breathing ragged. I have lost my father's scar. I have lost my mother's voice. But I have not lost a single word you wrote. Seren's vision blurred with tears. When you are near me, the world has edges again, he continued. When you speak, I remember who I am. When you leave, I begin to dissolve. His hands found hers, gripping so tightly she could feel his pulse through his fingertips. I sent you away because I could not bear the thought of you vanishing the way I am vanishing. But you are telling me the distance is destroying you too. Yes, Seren whispered. We share a bond, he said. Not as a question, but as a confession, and the weight of it settled into the room like something that had been waiting a long time to be spoken aloud. I know, Seren said. I think I have known since the first letter. His forehead dropped against hers. She could feel his breath on her lips, could feel the tremor running through his body, and the pull in her chest had become almost unbearable. If I let you stay, he said against her mouth, I cannot promise you safety. I am not asking for safety. What are you asking for? Seren looked into his eyes, at the exhaustion and the fear and the longing and the impossible, stubborn refusal to break despite everything the curse had taken from him. I am asking you to stop disappearing alone, she said. He kissed her. Or she kissed him. It happened in the space between one breath and the next, and the moment their lips met, the pull in her chest erupted into something blinding. His hands cradled her face, tilting her head, deepening the kiss until she could feel it in her spine, in her bones. He lifted her, and she felt the sheer, overwhelming strength of him as he carried her through corridors she did not see, past guards who looked away, through a door that closed behind them with a sound like the world narrowing to a single room, his chambers, his bed, and a closeness that words could not describe. A connection so deep it bypassed language entirely and spoke in warmth and breath and the steady rhythm of two hearts learning to beat in time. At some point, the bond sealed. She felt it snap into place, bright and golden and vast, a bridge between two minds that the curse could not cross. Warm, alive, theirs. They lay tangled afterward, his arm around her waist, her head against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. He was falling asleep. She could feel it through the bond, the slow surrender of consciousness, the tension draining from his body like water from a cracked vessel. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. Already half gone, already sinking. "Always," she whispered. He slept, deep and complete and peaceful, his breathing evening out into something she had never heard from him before, the sound of a man who was not afraid of what waited behind his eyelids. Seren closed her eyes and let sleep take her. She woke in the gray. But it was not the library she knew. The shelves were collapsing. Entire sections had crumbled into mountains of ash and dust, and the air was thick with fragments of dissolving pages. The silence that had once been oppressive was now replaced by sound, a deep, resonant cracking, like the spine of the world splitting open. And standing at the center of the destruction, her back straight and her eyes burning with fury, was a woman Seren had never seen before. The woman turned to look at her. Her gaze was ancient and patient and utterly merciless. "So," the woman said, her voice echoing through the collapsing library, "he found an anchor." She smiled, and the smile was the coldest thing Seren had ever seen. "Let us see how long it holds." The woman's eyes were the color of a bruise, deep violet ringed with black, and they held a grief so enormous it had calcified into something harder, something sharp. "Lysara," Seren breathed, and she did not know how she knew the name, only that the bond humming in her chest supplied it like a whispered warning. "Clever girl," Lysara said. Her voice carried the strange acoustics of the Fade, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "He told you about me then." "Did he tell you what he took?" Seren's stomach turned. "He told me enough." "There is no enough. There is only everything, and that is what I will take from him. Every memory, every name, every face he has ever loved, until he is as empty as I am." The library groaned around them. Another shelf collapsed, sending a cascade of ash spiraling upward. Seren flinched but held her ground. "Where is he?" she demanded. Lysara tilted her head, and her gaze drifted past Seren to somewhere deeper in the ruin. "Where he always is. Watching, accepting. He has never once fought me here. Did you know that? Not once in 14 months. Seren turned and ran. She found him 3 rows deep in the collapsing stacks, standing before a shelf that was nearly bare. Only a handful of books remained, their spines cracked and trembling. He was watching them with the expression of a man attending a funeral he had known was coming. "Soren," she gasped, reaching for him. He looked at her, and the bond between them pulsed with something that nearly drove her to her knees. Guilt. Vast, corrosive, bone-deep guilt that had been eating him alive long before Lysara's curse gave it teeth. "You should not have come back here," he said. His voice was hollow. "Stop saying that to me." "She is right." He nodded toward the darkness where Lysara waited. "I took everything from her. Her mate, her future, her reason to exist. This is what I owe." "You owe a debt," Seren said, gripping his arm. "But not this one." Through the bond she felt it, the full architecture of his guilt laid bare. Not just Erevan, the soldiers who died under his command, the villages that burned before he arrived. Every failure, every loss, every moment where he had been king and king had not been enough. The curse had taken these memories and weaponized them, whispering that a better man would have found another way. And Soren believed it. He did not fight the Fade because he believed he deserved it. Shh. She lost her mate, Soren said, his voice cracking. I gave the order. I ended him myself. Erevan would not yield, and I took his life, and she watched. I took a bond like ours and severed it. How do I forgive myself for that? Lysara appeared at the end of the row, her presence darkening the air around her. You do not, she said. That is the point. Seren looked at the woman, at the grief that had become rage, that had become a curse, and she felt something unexpected. Not anger, recognition. You think he deserves to lose everything because he took everything from you, Seren said to Lysara. And he agrees with you. That is why the curse holds. Not because your magic is strong, but because he will not let it go. Lysara's expression flickered. Just for a moment. Seren turned back to Soren. I know what it feels like to believe you deserve to be forgotten, she said, and her voice was steady even though her heart was breaking. I was left on a doorstep before I could walk. No name, no note, no reason. Just a baby someone decided was not worth keeping. Soren's eyes found hers, and the guilt in the bond shifted, making room for something else. Attention, focus, her. I spent my whole life believing they were right, Seren continued. That if I had been worth remembering, someone would have remembered me. I made myself small. I lived inside other people's stories because I did not believe I deserved one of my own. Her voice broke, but she did not stop. But that is not how it works. Being left was not evidence of what I deserved. It was evidence of what they could not give. And what happened in that war, that was not evidence of who you are. It was evidence of what war does. You did not want Erevan to fall. You begged him to surrender. And when there was no path left, you did the terrible thing that needed to be done so that innocent people could survive. She took his face in her hands and made him look at her. You are allowed to carry the grief. You are allowed to honor the dead. But you are not allowed to let it consume you, because the people you saved are still alive, and they need their king, and I need you. And I refuse to watch you disappear into a debt you have already paid. The Fade trembled. Lysara stepped forward, her violet eyes blazing. He took my mate from me. Seren looked at her, tears streaming down her face. And I am sorry. I am so sorry for what you lost. But keeping him here will not bring Erevan back. It will only make sure 2 people are destroyed instead of 1. You are not punishing him anymore. You are punishing yourself, trapping yourself in this place right alongside him, reliving the worst moment of your life every single night. Lysara's face contorted. You do not know what it is like. To lose the person who makes the world make sense? Seren whispered. I almost do. I am standing here watching it happen. The stillness that followed was absolute. Lysara looked at Soren. He looked back at her, and for the first time, instead of guilt, Seren felt something else move through the bond. Compassion. A sorrow that was not about himself but about the woman who had lost everything and built a prison from the wreckage. I am sorry, Soren said. Not the hollow apology of a man accepting punishment. The real, wrecked, human apology of a man who understood loss because he was living it. I am sorry, I could not find another way. Lysara's hands clenched at her sides. Her jaw trembled. Let him go, Seren said gently. Let yourself go. For a long, suspended moment, nothing moved. Then Lysara closed her eyes. A sound escaped her, not a word, not a scream, but something older than language, a grief finally allowed to be grief instead of vengeance. The library shuddered, the crumbling stopped. And then, slowly, impossibly, a book on the nearest shelf began to rebuild itself. Pages reformed from ash, drifting upward and settling back into place. Then another. Then another. Lysara opened her eyes. They were clear for the first time, the violet bright and washed clean. She looked at Soren one last time, then turned and walked into the gray, and the fade absorbed her gently, like arms opening to welcome someone home. The library rebuilt itself around them, shelf by shelf, book by book. Soren dropped to his knees and Seren caught him, held him as 14 months of accumulated anguish finally broke the surface and poured out of him in great, shaking waves. "I have you," she whispered into his hair, pressing her lips against his temple. "I have you, and I am not letting go." She woke in his arms, in his bed, in the warm, amber light of a winter morning. Snow pressed against the window panes, and the fire had burned to embers, and Soren was awake beside her, looking at her with eyes that were clear and full and present. "My mother hummed in the key of D," he said softly, "and my father's scar was on his left hand." Seren smiled through her tears and pulled him closer. The curse did not lift like a veil. It receded like a tide, slowly and unevenly, leaving behind stretches of clarity punctuated by pockets of fog that thinned a little more each week. Some memories returned whole. Others came back in fragments that Soren learned to hold gently rather than grip. The names of his advisors settled back into place. The treaties and trade routes rebuilt themselves in his mind piece by piece. Some things did not return. He never recovered the melody his mother used to hum, only the key. He never fully remembered the color of his childhood bedroom walls. He learned to let those gaps exist without panic, to treat them as the natural texture of a life lived rather than evidence of something stolen. Seren helped, not by filling the gaps for him, though she could have, but by reminding him that a story did not need every word intact to be worth telling. Their mating was formalized at the winter court. The whispers were predictable. A bookbinder from a village most could not find on a map, standing beside the Alpha King in borrowed finery, smelling of ink and binding glue. The court did not know what to make of her. Soren did not care. "They will adjust," he murmured against her temple the night of the ceremony, his arm tight around her waist, his voice rough with a contentment she still was not used to hearing. "And if they do not," Seren asked, "then they can take it up with their king, who happens to remember every single word his mate has ever spoken to him." He paused, "including the part about the nail budget, which I have not forgiven you for documenting." Seren laughed, and the sound filled the room like light. Now, months later, she woke to pale winter sunlight and the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her. No fade, no crumbling library, no ash, just warmth and stillness, and the quiet miracle of a man who slept through the night and woke remembering who he was and who he loved. She settled against his chest. His arm tightened around her without waking. Outside, snow fell softly on the palace grounds, covering everything in white, and Seren closed her eyes and let the silence hold them both.